seeing like a state, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. And we might ask the question then, what is it to see like a state? How does the state perceive things? And the state perceives populations and lands and people as sort of resources to be apprehended, with a desire to understand as it can understand from a centralized standpoint. The perception is all about apprehension and control over the population and the land. So with that framework in mind, he asks the question, how do so many of these well-intentioned utopian schemes go so far awry? And he looks at a number of case studies throughout history. In this video, I'm going to go over the villagization that happened in Tanzania, where the state sort of moved all the population into villages. And I'll also go over his case of Brazilia, which was basically a centrally planned and designed city. But I'll also talk about these other just habits that we see in many different places throughout history of designing cities with a grid map, imposing addresses, imposing standard metrics, imposing last names, all of that kind of stuff sort of falls into this category of seeing like a state and trying to organize the system to be easily apprehendable from the perspective, basically, of an outsider. And he sets up 4 factors that will lead a utopian scheme to turn into something totalitarian. And the first is going to be an administrative ordering of nature and society. This is the use of statecraft tools to plan a society. And this isn't inherently bad by itself. As a matter of fact, he says, actually, you need all 4 of these for things to go really awry. The second condition here is what he calls high modernist ideology. And let me read you some quotes. High modernist ideology is best conceived as a strong, one might even say muscle-bound, version of self-confidence about scientific and technical progress. The expansion of production, the growing satisfaction of human needs, the mastery of nature, including human nature, and above all, the rational design of social order commensurate with the scientific understanding of natural laws. The carriers of high modernism, once their plans miscarried or were thwarted, tended to retreat to what I call miniaturization, the creation of a more easily controlled micro-order in the model cities, model villages, and model farms. By itself, a high modernist perspective will not devolve into tyranny. You need the last 2 conditions for this to become something really bad. And these last 2 conditions are a state that's willing and able to use power to impose its vision, and a people who is unable to resist. And at the end, I'll come back and briefly look at his recommendations for ways a population can resist this kind of authoritarian control. He starts out with this great analogy to beekeeping, where he says in pre-modern times, people had to actually drive away the bees and destroy the colony to collect the honey. And in modern times, of course, there's beehives that are sort of organized and designed in these columns with wax setups where it's prepared for the bees to come into, and they're structured so that the queen bee cannot lay her eggs above a certain level. And the purpose of a modern beehive is to be able to extract the honey so that somebody can come in and take something from the colony of bees without destroying the bee colony, but it's organized sort of first and foremost around the need for honey, the one who wants to come in and apprehend. So you can see from that example, this is not inherently bad. For example, the beehive has to be designed with what is good for the bees in mind so that you attract the bees. But its design is first and foremost, it's got this organization, it's got this ability to apprehend at the front of its mind. Our first case study will be the case of scientific forestry. And this was developed in Prussia between 1765 and 1800, and he says about it, its emergence cannot be understood outside the larger context of the centralized state-making initiatives of the time period. So this is during the Old Enlightenment, where they were thinking a lot about rationality and the scientific method. And this method of sort of controlling all of the variance in a forest and just having one type of tree, getting rid of all the complicated moss and other bushes and things that make a forest variable, so that you could actually do experiments and sort of tweak one little thing at a time and observe it. In one of these planned forests, all the trees are the same age, and its purpose is to get wood to sell. That's sort of what the focus is. And anything that doesn't serve a purpose for the state, like the insects and the moss and the bushes, that's sort of not paid attention to, not noticed, not built into the structure of what's going on. It's a view of a forest with an abstract tree rather than an actual tree with all of its intricacies. And you might ask, did this work? Did it produce good wood? And it turns out the first generation of trees actually fared pretty well in these forests, but starting at the second generation, things completely deteriorated. And he says the reasons for this are complicated, but it does have to do with the interconnected life that sustains trees, where all of these things that are not immediately of value to the state are really important for maintaining the health of a tree and the health of a forest. And language plays a role in shaping this kind of perception, where you have timber and crops are things that are of value to the planner, whereas plants that are defined as weeds and insects that are defined as pests, those become sort of bad. And that valence, that emotional valence of the language around how you talk about these plants and animals, that becomes really relevant in terms of how the whole forest is shaped. So the endeavor basically failed, but even when the forest was allowed to return to a real forest, not a controlled forest, the imprint of this planning was still there. And this is going to be an analogy that will appear over and over when central planners try to do something like this. There's often failure, but what emerges at the end after all is said and done and things have been allowed to return to a more healthy natural state, the imprint of the design is still embedded in the situation. Let's turn now to the case of forced villagization in Tanzania. And this took place between 1973 and 1976. So over a 3-year window, they moved their population from being scattered across the countryside into these villages. And that was not an option for the people. The people were forced there. So what did that look like? How did it go down? What is the purpose of forcing people into villages? And of course, this does make it easier to provide services, schools, water systems, states when people are gathered together in a village as opposed to scattered everywhere. It also obviously makes the population more manageable. And let me read you a couple of quotes on the goals. The thinly veiled subtext of villagization was also to reorganize human communities in order to make them better objects of political control and to facilitate the new forms of communal farming favored by the state. It would rip the peasantry from their traditional surroundings and networks and would put them down in entirely new settings where it was hoped they could then be more readily remade into modern producers following the instruction of experts. In a larger sense, of course, the purpose of forced settlement is always disorientation and then reorientation. Now, in that quote, he talks about instruction from the experts on farming practices. And one of the problems and one of the reasons people resisted this kind of instruction, other than it's a little bit patronizing and condescending, is that instruction did not always account for people's desires about how they conduct their farm. It didn't always account for people's side jobs or their other things that they had involved in their lives. It didn't account for gender divisions of labor or seasonality of that particular region. It didn't account for family size and the individual desires and goals and hopes of this particular farming family. So there was a resistance to that kind of oversight. And how exactly did the government accomplish this? Because there's going to be both carrots and sticks that are getting people to move. There's also going to be really organized management. So there were specific days where government officials and the military came into spaces and moved people on that day from where they actually lived to the new village where they were planned to live. And part of the stick involved was, if you don't move, we're going to destroy your home. Or if you do move, we're still going to destroy your home to make sure you don't go back. Another one of the sticks was the threat that you will not get famine relief if you don't do this. And this was something that worked well with people because recently they had experienced a famine. So people knew the horrors of not having food. And here the government's saying, we'll protect you in any future scenario, but only if you live in this village that we have planned for you. The carrots, of course, are the things the government is promising will show up in those villages. This is things like schools, like piped water, like medical clinics. All of that, they're saying, if you move, actually you will have access to these things. We will build these things once your population moves in. And some of the population wanted that and was willing to go for that carrot, but they wanted it in writing before they would actually move. Also, not all regions in Tanzania had equal pressure from the government to move into these villages. As a matter of fact, wealthier regions and regions that had more government officials were in many cases exempt from this kind of thing, as is often the case. So the process did involve some heavy violence and coercion, but it was less than in Stalinist Russia because a couple of the other case studies in the book took place in Stalinist Russia, where there was much more intense enforcement and much more intense use of state power against the people. In Tanzania, there was a lot more unofficial production and smuggling and foot dragging, where the people were resisting a little bit of this coercion. And he quotes this report from a bureaucrat at the end of this, where they're talking about the situation in a way that is blanketly triumphant and does not acknowledge any of the harms done to the people. So let me give you that. This is a tremendous achievement. It is an achievement of the TANU and government leaders in cooperation with the people of Tanzania. It means that something like 70% of our people have moved their homes in the space of about 3 years. He also mentions that the government bureaucrats carrying this out are impervious to criticism or disconfirming evidence. So let me read you one more quote on the lessons learned from this case study. They had also forgotten the most important fact about social engineering. Its efficiency depends on the response and cooperation of real human subjects. If people find the new arrangement, however efficient in principle, to be hostile to their dignity, their plans, and their tastes, they can make it an inefficient arrangement. Let's move to our second case, which is the planned city of Brazilia. And he says this is basically the closest thing we have to a high modernist city. Now, the author says the design of Brazilia was inspired by this particular architect named Le Corbusier. And he wasn't actually the architect of Brazilia, but rather the designers of Brazilia were sort of looking to the work and the writing and the other visions of this one architect. And the author actually spends a good chunk of that chapter talking about Le Corbusier's vision, which is basically a high modernist vision, and laying out how this guy thought. And as I read it, I could not help but thinking about Ian McGilchrist's right brain, left brain distinction, where left brain thinking reduces everything to a representation rather than the thing itself. So it's the left brain thinking is the map, the right brain thinking is the territory. The right brain can perceive parts of reality that don't fit well into our current understanding of the world. It can perceive, the right hemisphere that is, can perceive the uniqueness of people. The right hemisphere contextualizes everything, whereas the left hemisphere decontextualizes everything. Everything is just a representative person or a representative house, rather than a real house with all of its nuanced complexities. The left hemisphere sees people as automatons or as representatives of a group rather than unique individuals. And the left hemisphere is all about control. It's about apprehending, and you can tell apprehending really is the way states view things. Seeing like a state is seeing like somebody who wants to apprehend stuff from a population, rather than the right hemisphere way of viewing things is not so much about power, but about seeing other people as they are, about being in right relationship with those people. And that is sort of the opposite of seeing like a state. And the way this particular visionary architect thought was really about model cities and miniaturization. It was about him looking from this God's eye standpoint down on a miniature city where the design was according to his mind, people behaved according to the way he expected them to behave. And everything was just in order under his control, basically. Now, turning to Brazilia, it was a city that was designed specifically for civil servants. And the city was designed with a mind toward transforming Brazil, transforming its culture and its structure from the inside out from this city. The goal of making over Brazil and Brazilians necessarily implied a disdain for what Brazil had been. In this sense, the whole point of the new capital was to be a manifest contrast to the corruption, backwardness, and ignorance of the old Brazil. You can tell there is a disdain here for historical context. The planning of the city was entirely future-oriented, as if somebody could create something that was not attached to its past, that people wouldn't experience as contempt for themselves if you're viewing their culture and their past as something to be left behind. If you look at the design of Brazilia, it did not have a lot of space for public life on the street. It didn't have a whole lot of large city streets and public gathering spaces, other than this one huge gathering space that doesn't really feel welcoming, it's so large. There's not these smaller public gathering spaces for people to meet friends and neighbors and just get used to each other's faces as they go about their business. And people who move there today oftentimes describe it as a city without crowds, where it doesn't have the hustle and bustle of city life as people meet serendipitously and have these interactions with people in their community just based on being in the same space. He talks about if you want to meet with friends there, you have to plan it specifically. You don't accidentally run into friends on the street or on the corner where both of you live. And one thing the author points out is that without such spaces, you do have less room for riot and protest and unrest that tends to start and bubble up from these public spaces like the street. And yet he also points out oftentimes those are the spaces where culture forms, where festivals and bands and public discourse over policy, all of that stuff happens in this space that's this unplanned way that people interact with one another. So it eliminates or it reduces the chances of riots, but also reduces the chance of real cultivation of that country's culture. So the city does still exist today, and it has the imprint of this original sort of central planning style of design in the structure of its buildings, the layout of its streets, and all of that. But 75% of the population there does not live in planned housing. Rather, it's the unplanned housing that popped up as you brought workers in to work on the city, and they wanted to live in spaces that were not like these uniform automaton spaces to live. They wanted their own unique places of living. The style of city planning from this high modernist school of thought was actually very egalitarian. They had basically no class distinctions built into the way they structured how houses would look, how things would be structured. But of course, when people came in and built up their own houses according to their own styles, that introduced this class distinction that's basically characteristic of the unplanned part of Brazilia. The city was also not as popular as planners expected it to be. So even to this day, the city has less than half the population that the planners had expected to move in based on people just being attracted to the style of the city itself. And he says there's basically two versions of Brazilia, where one of them's the planned version and the other's the unplanned version. And he says these things are symbiotic, which is why there's the imprint of the vision of this architect, even though things evolved very differently than the architect expected. Let's turn now to maps, names, metrics, and language, because these are all tools of statecraft that are used by states to restructure things. And he talks a lot about cadastral maps, where these are maps that are designed to show the boundaries of property. And oftentimes they're used for tax purposes, for purposes of structuring property law. One interesting fact he gives is that in pre-modern states, sometimes taxes happened as a whole community. Like the whole community was taxed, the whole community was punished if they didn't pay the tax. Whereas the cadastral map makes it easier to hold individuals accountable rather than communities, which has a lot of value in terms of administering a state where you need to collect taxes. The asymmetry of power is much bigger between an individual who owes taxes and the state than it is between a whole community who could come together and fight and the state. Such maps are also useful for people coming in from the outside to do administrative business or to do military business. Because if you need somebody in the community to be your guide to show you where are the people who matter, where do they live, where is the administrative function of this little community, then that empowers the community who can decide who is the person who will be our representative, and they can show or not show whatever they choose. When it comes to maps, there's also the famous case in Amsterdam in World War II, where the Office of Statistics had put together a map of the city that included people's heritage. It included whether or not they were Jewish. And that map had been constructed years before World War II, not realizing that this could happen. But once the map existed, the Nazis were able to come in and easily find all of the Jewish people that they were trying to take in and deport. And so just the existence of a map makes it easy for anyone, friend or foe, to come in and engage with that community in ways that move power to the outsider. Names and official versions of names are another way that states can come in and control populations or put official obligations on populations and enforce those obligations. So you might imagine if the state had no access to the list of people in the town, then it would be hard to come in and make sure everybody paid their taxes or everybody did whatever. And we kind of think of first name, last name as being the standard for how names have been, but that actually wasn't the case throughout history. In fact, if you look at many communities throughout history, there's a lot of different norms for naming people. And sometimes people go by different names at different times in their lives. For example, infancy, childhood, adulthood. Sometimes they'll have a different name after death. Sometimes they have different names in different communities where with same-sex friends you're known in one way, with in-laws you're known in a different way by a different name. You can have different names for people when you're joking or when you're in a ritual or when you're in mourning. And so when communities have these fluid ways of referring to each other, that's difficult for the state to use to come in and implement control. As such, one thing that's been done throughout history is for states to come in and say, you have to go by your official name. He talks about the Shin dynasty in China imposing surnames for the purposes of forced labor and taxation. He talks about the authorities in the Philippines imposing people's names through the educational system, where the teachers would have to make sure the students could only use their official name in class and none of the local names for each other. And a lot of other official naming techniques serve similar purposes. The creation of birth and death certificates, more specific addresses, that is, more specific than something like John on the Hill, identity cards, passports, social security numbers, photographs, fingerprints, and most recently DNA profiles have superseded the rather crude instrument of the permanent surname. Imposing standardized metrics also has a similar role of making management of a population more easy. So you might imagine if you say everybody who trades in corn has to use pounds as the units that they're measuring the corn in, or measure the milk and fluid ounces. That makes it easier to track how much trade is going on, but also to compare prices. It makes trade easier. If everybody is using miles or kilometers to measure the distance between their villages, that's going to make it easier for the government to plan trips to go to these communities to implement official business. And one fun localized example he gives is that in Malaysia, when you ask people what's the distance between your villages, they'll answer in something like, that's 3 rice cookings away. And you kind of have to know the local way of making rice and local knowledge to know what that even means. They're talking about this in terms of a time distance. Well, that depends how fast do people in this region generally walk. So a government official could not really know from that information how long a trip to that region would take. So by standardizing it, it has to be measured and reported in kilometers. The government can more easily assess and manage power over that population. Napoleon enforced the metric system in France. And speaking of France, France also imposed a nationalized language and enforces that. And language is one of those things where if a local community has its own unique dialect and unique language that's not understandable to outsiders, that creates an autonomy for that community in a way almost like nothing else. If officials can't actually write effective propaganda or effective instructions in language that that community can understand, that limits the state's ability to come in and implement their vision for that town. A nationalized language also makes contracts easier to enforce by the state. And of course, there's a lot of value in the ability to have those contracts. You can have things like trade is easier and deeds, mortgages on loans, property rights. So things like sales and loans and property deeds, those are way easier to manage and to enforce when you have all of them in the same language, where the enforcement and the courts and the system that actually puts you in jail if you don't follow through with that contract is in a single language. But an official language can also create a hierarchy of cultures, where the people whose native language is the official language, those people can navigate the system better. People who speak other languages, they will need somebody to help them navigate the system. Now, what about resistance? How do populations resist these high modernist efforts to remake their society? And he does say it's actually different on a case-by-case basis. There's no cookie-cutter recipe that's going to be successful every time. But he does give a few features of a society that will help this. And the first and top of the list is going to be institutions. And he calls for working representative institutions through which a resistant society could make its influence felt. And here he's talking about institutions like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, a commitment to democracy, civil rights of various sorts. And he talks about the way rulers do not go hungry, so it is easy for them to ignore the people's plea when they say they go hungry. So if there is a way that sort of can bring to rulers' attention, no, this hunger is real, you cannot ignore it, that's going to be key. He talks about the need for high modernists to acknowledge that people actually do have on-the-ground knowledge and information that the rulers or the people trying to implement a policy like this cannot know. So having mechanisms for feedback between those implementing a policy and those affected by it is going to be important. He also stresses that having something that is reversible, like when these high modernists come in and put plans into place that they think might have a good effect, if they find out that this is not going to work or this is harming people, there needs to be a way to backtrack and to reverse any initial things they were trying to implement. He talks about the need to take small steps at a time and to watch for feedback before proceeding further with a plan. He talks about the need for rulers to be flexible and open and responsive to the population. He also mentions the importance of having a society that is committed to the belief that there are certain realms, certain spaces that are not legitimate spaces for the state to interfere. And here's a quote: "The existence and belief in a private sphere of activity in which the state and its agencies may not legitimately interfere." And of course, he is kind of calling for a more decentralized nature of power, where a lot of the power is shifted to the people who are on the ground actually experiencing the effects. And yet he says this isn't necessarily an unadulterated case for markets. He says, okay, yes, markets can have that individualized power, but markets also have this overarching structure. There are institutions underneath which markets must exist. And so those institutions are very much subject to high modernist control. Markets can come under the control of these high modernist centrally planning agents. If you liked this video, you might also like my video on the book Hierarchy in the Forest. This is also by an anthropologist, and he's also looking at power dynamics. But in this case, it's going to be power dynamics in egalitarian forager tribes and chimpanzee groups, and sort of asking about human evolution between those two groups.